Hey everyone, I'm Sahaj. I'm a student at the Columbia Law School, and today I'm going to be breaking down the DOJ's antitrust complaint against Apple and why I think it's so important. We're going to go through the complaint specifically, I think what the key dynamics of this antitrust case are going to be, both politically and also legally, and also why I think it's such an important case for the future of virtual markets. So, I first want to start with just what are the stakes of this complaint? Before we get into the specific allegations that the DOJ makes, why does this case matter? And I think the real reason that this case matters, and I think the real reason that a lot of antitrust cases, especially in high technology markets, matter, is because there often is a lot of potential energy around specific platform shifts at specific moments in time. And so if you think about the shift from desktop OS to mobile, that was a really, really important platform shift that created an entire digital economy, all those apps that were built on top of that platform shift, which fundamentally altered our lives. And I think we're actually on the precipice of another one of these platform shifts. And so I don't know if you saw this, but just bring in outside information, things that you might have been seeing on social media or other places. There was, recently a video on X that I saw that was about this sort of paralyzed person who had one of these Neuralink chip implants and was able to play chess as if he was using the force. And so, that was something that I think is actually really relevant to this case. And so is, a couple weeks ago, there was this video of Mark Zuckerberg talking about how he thinks his VR headset is better than Apple's VR headset. And so in the backdrop, you see sort of these sort of new technologies. You can call it the metaverse, you can call it VR, these sort of more immersive, different types of platforms in and ways in which you can engage with digital content. Whether it's headsets, chips, things like this. And I think that is really the direction in which some of these OSs, some of these digital markets are going to increasingly be moving in the future. You can sort of feel the potential energy. There's something brewing here. There's something cooking. I mean, this is something that Zuckerberg's been talking about since, at least the 2010s. This is something that Apple's been developing for a very long time itself. Other companies are working on VR headsets. Like I mentioned, Musk is working on this Neuralink interface. There's something that's happening here. There's a lot of innovation and potential energy that's ready to explode into this sort of Cambrian, explosion of innovation. And so I think that is the backdrop for this case. That's why this case matters, because I don't think that potential energy won't turn kinetic if this case wins or loses. I don't think it's that binary, but I do think that this case has the opportunity to be a massive accelerant to bringing new players into the market and therefore creating this fantastic competition that drives way more innovation in this platform shift into these new ways of immersing ourselves in virtual worlds, virtual content, and all of these other things. So I think that is the reason that this case matters, turning that potential energy of that platform shift into the best form of kinetic, vibrant, dynamic energy in the American tradition. And so that I think is why this complaint matters. And that's what I really want to be constantly analyzing as we're going through this. If what the DOJ alleges is true, what are the types of remedies? What are the things that can serve as an accelerant to innovation into that platform shift, and then all the downstream and derivative markets that will emerge from that platform shift, things that haven't really existed on the mobile platform, but have the potential to be massive on these other platforms. With that said, let's go into the complaint, let's look through the allegations, and let's keep going back to this theme of how can this platform shift be accelerated by the use of antitrust law. So to start with, the complaint basically alleges that Apple has built this dominant iPhone platform ecosystem, and it's tremendously valuable. Obviously Apple's one of the most valuable companies by market cap in the world, and there's a lot of sort of narrative here about how Apple's internal thinking about this is how do we continue to keep people locked into our ecosystem, and how do we make switching costs as high as possible so that people can't go to alternative ecosystems, whether it's Android or new platform that might emerge in a platform shift that Apple doesn't want to be losing its power to. And there are all sorts of things that this complaint I think rightfully sets up, which is this case really does revolve around things like all the downstream markets like financial services, fitness, gaming, social media, news media, entertainment, and more. I think if you look at sort of the history of the antitrust litigation against Apple, clearly some of the bigger cases have been about these sort of virtual worlds, about some of these downstream markets. If you think about, like, for example, Epic Games versus Apple, well, Tim Sweeney has this like expansive vision of a metaverse with many doors. And so you can enter through, your Apple devices, you can enter through your Xbox, and you can interact with everyone on all these different platforms, but within the same unified metaverse. I think that's really what's at stake in this case. Are we going to allow this sort of, you know, many doors approach, or is there going to be one narrow gate that everyone has to sort of cram through in order to enter these sort of downstream markets? And if that's the case, how does that affect innovation? How does that affect competition? And how does that really fundamentally affect our ability to accelerate and create all sorts of new and exciting, interesting possibilities? So that's sort of the narrative that they start with. Then they go a little bit into what Apple's history has been. And so, they talk about how the iPod really fundamentally changed Apple's position, and this like sort of ecosystem platform started to emerge first with the iPod, then with the iPhone in 2007, and eventually over, a substantial period of time, this ecosystem continued to grow and grow organically as developers rushed in to build on top of Apple's incredible ecosystem, that platform that Apple did so well to create. And so, I just want to make a really important point. Certainly, I don't think that people are saying that Apple is an evil company for developing the iPhone. That's precisely the type of innovation that we want. I think, and this is something that often gets misinterpreted in antitrust cases. The goal here isn't to punish Apple, it's to unleash the restraints so that the next Apple can emerge, so that we can have more and more interesting platforms develop in ways in which they might not currently, because of how much market and monopoly power Apple has accrued in the present moment. And so I always want to keep that framing in mind. As we continue to work through this complaint, a key part of it, of the government's case, of what they're alleging is anti-competitive here, is that Apple continues to use its control of who can enter the iOS market and interact with people in the iPhone ecosystem through its app review process, its control of app distribution, its control of the financial services, and its control of these APIs. And so they keep going back to this, which is essentially, when anyone tries to get into this market and tries to disintermediate Apple's, like sort of iron control over its ecosystem and users, this is when Apple sort of goes back to its app review, app distribution, and other powers to sort of either make their product worse, make it harder for them to build their product, kick their app off the App Store. These are the sorts of exclusionary practices that Apple continues to go back and continues to do in order to maintain its monopoly power. So then I think we get to one of the key inflection points in the complaint, which is, at the very beginning. And this, I think, sets up also a really interesting dynamic, which is that Apple, using its control of distribution, using its control of APIs, is suppressing, and this is what the DOJ states, the following technologies. And I think this is not an exhaustive list, but certainly I think there's something to infer from both the number of key technologies that the DOJ lists here, but also the sequence in which they talk about them. So the first is super apps. So if you think about what are the super apps that exist today, certainly Elon Musk's vision of what X can be is this sort of everything app, a place where you can settle financial payments, a place where you can do all sorts of content, whether it's, long form video, short form video, essays, books, etc. He's trying to develop this sort of everything app for media and financial services, going back all the way to sort of, his PayPal days. This has sort of been his vision, to build one of these sort of super apps that can include all the key functionality you need on one platform that's built on top of Apple's sort of OS interface. And, what the DOJ is alleging is that Apple is denying access to these super apps in all sorts of small and big ways, again, through its control of its app store and who gets to get access to the OS market. And in doing so, it's preventing super apps from emerging as vigorously as they otherwise might. And this is going to be a really, really important point for reasons we'll discuss later in the complaint. They also talk about cloud streaming, game apps. Again, here you can think about things like Fortnite, things like Epic Games, this sort of metaverse with many doors that all exists in the cloud. And so you can enter through whatever hardware you want, but it's sort of this integrated user experience where you can interact with all your friends almost seamlessly in this sort of interoperable world. Then they talk about messaging apps. Again, you can think about things like iMessage and the green bubble, blue bubble. People tend to think this is not that big a deal, but ultimately it keeps going back to the same theme, right? Essentially, the more interoperable the world is, in which you can sort of talk to people, play games with people, interact with people, communicate with people through these super apps, transact with people. Ultimately, the easier it's going to be for new and interesting platforms to emerge, for people to take all that functionality and include this in new types of interfaces, whether it's VR headsets, brain chips, whatever. That is the future that can exist if switching costs are low, where people can sort of move from platform to platform, and then the platforms have to compete to become better and better and better. Smartwatches, again, talking about sort of all the downstream markets that exist, which are sort of locked up because Apple will always preference its own products in all these sort of markets, but also is excluding other people from developing really interesting and exciting new hardware and products. And then I think this is also a really interesting point, which is digital wallets. I think one of the reasons this matters is even moving beyond digital wallets. One of the things I think is like payments matter is because you think about all this emerging technology in the world of cryptocurrency, a world I don't understand particularly well, but certainly like the best chance for those types of companies, those types of ideas, those types of breakthroughs to get distribution is through the existing iOS platform. And certainly if Apple continues to make it very difficult to integrate with all the functionality of the iPhone, then those things are decelerated as opposed to accelerated. And I think ultimately, we don't know the future. No one has a crystal ball. No one knows how the world will develop. But the more open, the more interoperable that these really important platforms are, the more other platforms can emerge, the more other features can emerge, other products, things that we can't even think about yet, but that could be fundamentally important going forward. And so, they talk about all these like sort of foreclosures and all these key downstream markets that could eventually become more important than the upstream market of the phone. And I always want to keep going back to that theme. I think that's a really important point. Then they start talking about something that I think is also really interesting, which is, you think about Steve Jobs, Apple, always innovating. Every phone's better than the last. iPod, iPhone, things like this, apps, all this stuff. And there's this sort of like clear progression of the technology, really interesting products all the time. And you think about Tim Cook's Apple, which is sort of like more consolidating all the gains that they've already made. And it's become much more, the stock certainly has become much more successful. The question you always have to ask is, has the product offering become dramatically better? Or is it more of the same with certain marginal tweaks here or there? And certainly what the complaint seems to be alleging is that Apple is focused more on the financialization of the business, more on stock buybacks, more on rewarding shareholders, and much, much less on things like R&D, which is fundamentally important if we're going to open up these new platforms. You think about all the money Zuckerberg's putting into the metaverse, into VR headsets, into bringing forward this new platform shift. And it's not clear that Apple's doing everything it could to be opening up these new markets. Then they talk about another really interesting point, which is, there's something Peter Thiel talks about in 0 to 1, which is essentially if you're a monopoly, you always want to pretend like you're not a monopoly. And certainly if you're doing something anti-competitive, you always want to pretend like it's pro-competitive or good for consumers. And so one of the narratives that Apple is always espousing is that the reason that it's excluding apps, the reason that it's preventing functionality, the reason that it's like, for example, not allowing other app stores onto the App Store or allowing other super apps on the App Store is because of things like privacy and security. And I think you always have to drill a little bit deeper into what are their true motives. Yes, that's what they're saying, but is that actually what they're doing? And certainly the DOJ is of the opinion that this is sort of a Trojan horse narrative. This is what they say, but the real intent is anti-competition, is consolidating the gains they've made from the Jobs era. Um, and then, you know, we can get into some of the specific things the complaint alleges that Apple has done. And so, if we continue, one of the other narratives that they're developing in this case is sort of talking about, the late 90s and how Apple itself was able to emerge because of a different antitrust case with a lot of similar themes against Microsoft. And so if you go back to the late 90s in our time machine, Microsoft had this massive monopoly on desktop OS. And they were trying to control the future of the internet. And there's this like great memo, I think from like 1994, 1995, where Bill Gates literally says, the internet is a tidal wave. This is going to change the entirety of our business, and we have to make sure that we control it. And so they started, tying Internet Explorer to Microsoft OS. They basically killed Netscape. And if the DOJ hadn't stepped in, I've seen certainly credible reporting and legal analysis that Microsoft would have then tried to self-preference things like Bing, prevent Google from ever emerging. Obviously, if they hadn't been able to been successful in doing that, who knows if YouTube, Facebook, Amazon, these other companies could have ever actually emerged, because Microsoft would have just kept killing them off by foreclosing their access to Microsoft consumers. And so you think about all the downstream value that's been created by opening up the internet. This case was a big part of that, this US versus Microsoft case, and therefore it's a big part of why Apple has been successful today. And I think what the DOJ is trying to say is that's why we have to bring this case against Apple so that the next Apple can emerge, the next Google can emerge. And I think that's really important to the thinking behind this legal case. If we continue, they talk about how Apple has these tight controls on app creation and even tighter controls on app distribution. And that's sort of the area in which they're able to exercise anti-competition to exclude people from having access to consumers on the iOS platform. Then they talk about how smartphones are platforms. They're more or less, defining a market here. And then they get into, sort of the illegal things that, at least in their view, they allege the illegal things that Apple is doing in order to maintain its monopoly power. This is called monopoly maintenance in the antitrust world, and that's sort of what they're getting into here. And so, Apple, they're saying, harms competition by imposing these sort of like deep restrictions on app developers and certainly who then gets access to iOS consumers. And they cite all these internal documents that show this sort of paranoia that's quite common in these incumbent monopoly firms, that they're going to be disintermediated by, when more and more functionality moves onto the apps. Eventually you can have access to the apps on any platform. Eventually you're not dependent on Apple anymore. And so therefore you can switch to an Android phone, or in the future to these new virtual platforms. Remember that potential energy argument, turning that into kinetic energy in places like VR, Neuralink, etc. And this is a big fear of Apple's. This is something they clearly recognize. And so, the complaint's basically talking about how Apple is driving away its own users from apps and other functionality that might threaten to disintermediate Apple's own power, reduce the switching cost. Apple does not want that. They want to increase the switching cost so that people are locked in forever. Then the complaint talks about sort of the restrictions Apple uses, like this 30% tax on all in-app purchases. This is something you see in other litigation, like the Epic versus Apple litigation that happened in California. And then they continue to sort of develop this narrative of how they're using their exclusionary power to keep people away from iOS customers in order to prevent any of these sort of very threatening new products from being able to compete for those customers. This theory of monopoly maintenance is not new. Like I mentioned, it was a key part of the US versus Microsoft case. And so just delving into the legal analysis there a little bit, essentially it's not necessarily illegal to have a monopoly. unless you're taking anti-competitive conduct to maintain that monopoly. And that's what the DOJ is alleging here, which is essentially by excluding people from the market, they're able to maintain their monopoly, which is the reason that Apple's conduct is illegal and why there need to be remedies in this market. This, to me, is really fundamentally one of the most important things in this complaint because it sets up an Elon versus Apple dynamic within this US versus Apple case. Essentially, what the DOJ is saying is if super apps like X, places where you have all sorts of functionality built into one app, really become powerful, really become popular, really become the place where people are transacting, communicating, creating content, monetizing content, doing all sorts of things that are really powerful in the digital economy. What then happens is you have access to X everywhere. You have access to X on your desktop, you have access to X on your Android phone, on these frontier platforms like the Neuralink interface, which is not ready yet, but might soon be ready. Things like VR headsets, this platform shift, you can have X on all these other platforms. And so what's stopping people once they really get used to doing most of their business on X from quickly deciding, you know what, this new platform is much more innovative. It has way better features. It's not annoying to carry around this phone. I can't drop it and it cracks. It's all virtual. Why don't I just, instead of buying the next iPhone, move more and more of my business onto these frontier platforms? And this is Apple's existential threat. This is the thing that could really eat into their margins, their monopoly power, and fundamentally their share price. And this is why Apple does not want super apps emerging in the United States on their platform. And the DOJ is talking about how essentially Apple has this fear of super apps. There are documents that are saying that the demand for iPhone would be reduced if these super apps take off. And so they've done all sorts of things in order to either throttle super apps, restrict their distribution, make them worse, and prevent them fundamentally from emerging on iOS. Again, so if we think about what Elon Musk's vision for X is, this is where it clashes fundamentally with Apple's business interests. And even before this case, you've sort of seen this dynamic with, for example, last year there was that super awkward picture of Tim Cook and Elon Musk at the Apple campuses. This is something that's clearly a point of friction between these two people, and fundamentally, I think between two visions of what the next platform is going to look like. What it's going to look like, is it going to be sort of controlled and dominated by one company, or is it going to be something that is available on all sorts of platforms because you have these super apps that merge, and therefore you can move a lot of your functionality from place to place to place to place. Wherever the next platform is with the best features, you can quickly go there. So this is a really important point in this case. Ultimately, again, here they're just basically talking about allowing, what these super apps are, how they could eventually become the main gateway for this, and why Apple would not want to, quote, let the barbarians in at the gate. Fundamentally, they want to protect iOS stickiness. So all of these words are sort of buzzwords for fundamentally anti-competitive intent, stickiness, moats. Whenever you hear that, think monopoly. Then they bring up a really interesting point, which is essentially super apps have taken off in other geographies. So in Asia, for example, there are all sorts of super apps, and this is sort of what Musk is modeling his movement of X into being, is based on sort of some of these Chinese super apps, and ultimately Apple has already recognized that in those places, this is actually really, really bad for their business because ultimately it lowers stickiness, it lowers lock-in to the iOS platform, and lowers the switching costs, which is what Apple does not want. They do not want the commoditization of smartphone hardware, which again drives all sorts of therefore anti-competitive conduct. They use all sorts of exclusionary requirements. They restrict mini programs on super apps. Obviously they take that 30% fee. All of these things are throttling the popularity of fundamentally of super apps. Let me talk about cloud streaming. I think you can even broaden this out to cloud generally. You know, if more and more of our lives are going to be based in these virtual worlds, if this is the place where we're going to conduct commerce, communications, transactions, payments, whatever, fundamentally, the more that's stored on any cloud platform, the easier it is. Again, remember the many gates metaphor. The easier it is for me to go to a VR headset and have everything that I have on my phone, have everything that I have on my desktop readily available. I don't have to transfer files. It's all hosted on the cloud, all hosted on the internet. And this is something that Apple also sees as an existential threat because it lowers switching costs. So you can see here, specifically in the gaming market, Apple's blocked cloud gaming for many years. They don't want this because fundamentally they want to prevent the emergence of technologies that could lower demand for the iPhone. Um, as we continue, they're talking about the DOJ is talking about how Apple uses its APIs in order to control what features people can build into apps to prevent the emergence not only of super apps but also specific verticals. So you think about iMessage and the blue and green bubble dynamic. This is part of this is again of Apple's doing. I think there's a company called Beeper, which proved that you could have more secure, safe Android to iPhone, iMessage communications that happen, but Apple did not want that, booted them from the App Store. This is fundamentally, I think, bad. You might think it's not a big deal. The argument that the DOJ is making, which I buy, is that for kids, for younger people, there's this sort of like status game that occurs when the bubble is blue versus the ugly green. And therefore, the kids get locked into the iOS ecosystem because they don't want to, look lame. And eventually, then they start using all the other Apple products, iCloud, whatever, iMessage, blah, blah, blah. All their data starts to get stored on Apple, switching costs over time increase. And so, this small little anti-competitive conduct, which might seem quite small to begin with, actually ends up developing into a massive switching cost later down the line. So, again, you might think like this is not that big a deal. I think it's part of a much bigger case, which is a bigger deal. They talk about then smartwatches. Again, if you think about, not just virtual platforms, but also different types of hardware platforms, different types of physical platforms, things like smartwatches, other types of interfaces, the more that they're tied to Apple's ecosystem, you can only, or it's much easier, or it's better to buy Apple's own products, even things like AirPods. The more you're going to stay locked into their ecosystem and new features. I think this is really the important point. New features, new things that Apple either doesn't have the incentive or the ability or the creativity or sort of the enterprise to develop or want to develop, or just the creativity to develop. These things then just don't come to market because why would I invest as a VC in a company that's going to develop this great smartwatch? Apple is just going to degrade my ability to connect to iOS consumers anyway, and then my investment is sunk. And so you end up with these sort of kill zones, these dead zones, in all sorts of interesting places where one small little innovation could open up an entirely new platform, an entirely new market. So I think, again, maybe you think smartwatches are not that important in the market. This is part of a broader argument, a broader narrative of things like smartwatches, other sort of hardware like AirPods, things like this that could fundamentally create different features. We never end up seeing them. And I think this is another area that's really important. Again, digital wallets, things like crypto platforms, things like other financial transaction platforms, places where transaction fees are much lower. All of these things are not happening because Apple does not want anyone else to develop digital wallets for the iPhone. And so, they always preference the Apple wallet. They make it much harder for anyone else to enter the market. You can't use, for example, tap to pay. These are all things that are alleged in this complaint. So here's, for example, the tap to pay. They talk about how sort of banks are foreclosed from entering the market. And this is, fundamentally bad for innovation in digital communications and in digital transactions, which are closely tied together. Then they talk about how Apple is unfairly, you know, creating more and more monopoly power on the phone level by keeping all these other things from merging, which allows them to continue to make a massive amount of money by both selling iPhones and then all the downstream derivative products. They talk about how, for example, Apple makes a ton of money from subscription services, and the reason they're able to do that is because they exclude anyone else from entering the market, and they generate more and more and more recurring revenue for themselves, which is fundamentally bad for consumers. Then they talk about what the anti-competitive effects of Apple's conduct are, of keeping people out of the market is, and they're saying number one, it's harming the competitive process, which is sort of a legal standard that's part of the legal case, the antitrust case against Apple, which is you're not supposed to harm the competitive process. And then they talk about how Apple has every incentive to continue to use this type of monopoly playbook in the future, and how this can be really bad. So you think about different hardware platforms. One we haven't talked about is cars. This is something they allege here specifically, CarPlay, right? Like cars are increasingly going to become part of the computing environment. People are going to do more and more work in their cars. If we have self-driving cars, all of a sudden that frees up, your morning commute to do things in your car because you're not driving that are fundamentally productive. Do things like check email, like watch movies, transact, be on X, whatever. And this is something that Apple is going to continue to try and dominate at the exclusion of any of these new platforms, any of these more maybe interesting or innovative platforms that might create an entirely better car experience that is not CarPlay, and that's fundamentally what Apple does not want to emerge. I think this is another area where this is going to be really, really important. Again, they talk about how the privacy and security narrative is a Trojan horse, is not a real reason for Apple's conduct. Instead, again, it is this monopolization strategy. They talk a little bit about the background of what Apple is, what they're doing. Defining things as these super apps is sort of like analogizing to things like middleware, which is sort of an old analogy to the 90s in the Microsoft case. Then you talk about what the markets are. So in antitrust cases, you have to define markets to show that there's anti-competitive effects in a relevant antitrust market, which is sort of a legal standard for, how do we think about who are the competitors here? How do we think about, who consumers have choices to switch between, and all of these things. You have to sort of define this before you can then allege that there are anti-competitive effects. They talk about performance smartphones. They talk about just smartphones, which is maybe an even broader market. And then they talk about how specifically the United States is an important geographic market, and I don't think anyone would dispute that. They're talking about, therefore, then once they define the markets, how Apple has monopoly power in these markets, and how that's fundamentally a bad thing. Lastly, there's some stuff about jurisdiction venue. I don't think that's going to be a big part of this case. Then they're alleging specifically which laws are violated. Again, remember, it's a monopoly maintenance type theory that's being brought here. So that's under the Sherman Act, Section 2. Again, they're talking about attempted monopolization. Usually these two go together, which is if there is monopolization, and therefore there often is attempted monopolization. And that's what they're saying here. They're saying that they're monopolizing the smartphone market and downstream markets. And then there are some state AG claims about violations of specific state antitrust acts. Usually these tend to correspond with the Sherman Act, not exactly one-to-one, but pretty closely. Then they're talking about, a request for relief. So let's say that a court finds that Apple has engaged in this anti-competitive conduct. What do we do? And what they're talking about is they're being super vague specifically here about what kind of relief is needed, but they're talking about stopping Apple from continuing to engage in these practices, preventing Apple from stopping the emergence of cross-platform technologies, stopping Apple from using these APIs to basically lock people into the platform, stopping Apple from using contractual terms to basically stop consumers from switching or going to other places. And so ultimately, these are the types of remedies they're talking about at this stage. And that's basically the full complaint. I would say, really to conclude, what this case is about is not about punishing Apple. Um, it is about opening up that space for these next generations of digital compute platforms, whether it is things like VR, brain headsets, cars. Again, like I mentioned, self-driving cars are going to be massive. Once we crack that technology that frees up your morning commute, that hour and a half, 45 minutes, where you can do things in the car, engage with the world digitally while you're on your way to work, or on your way back, or going anywhere, long trips, whatever. This is going to be a massive compute platform, and opening that up is going to unlock a tremendous amount of value. We don't just want Apple to dominate downstream VR, cars, whatever, these sort of brain interfaces, because it's not clear they will have the most innovative process to do that. Again, the narrative I would always give you is this is not Steve Jobs' Apple. This is Tim Cook's Apple. They will always put financialization first. They will put innovation closer to last. And so I think that's fundamentally why this case matters. It's an accelerant to innovation in this massive platform shift in compute that is happening right now, is going to continue to happen. And if this case is successful, will happen much faster and in a much more innovative way. We're on the verge of a Cambrian explosion in innovation in these new platforms. And that's why this case matters.